Hello and welcome back to Lutheran Witness Podcast. I'm your host, Roy Askins. Here on the Lutheran Witness Podcast, we normally share content online, but we have something special this month. We have two guests with us on the podcast to discuss articles in the May issue of the Lutheran Witness. So stay tuned for that. Before we get there, I want to give a quick shout out to our podcast partners, kfuo.org. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. Check them out, kfuo.org. All right, so today we have with us two writers from the May issue of the Lutheran Witness, which was titled Made and Marked by Christ, and it's a discussion, the whole issue is a discussion of the church. Today we have with us Stacey Egger and Sarah Reinsel, who will be talking about their articles in the May issue. We're going to see how long it takes. Maybe we'll get through both of them today, maybe we won't, but we'll talk about their articles and what they learned and how these articles can serve you in the church. So we're actually going to start off with Stacey. How are you doing today, Stacey?
Doing great.
And Sarah, how are you doing today?
Doing great.
Good. Thank you for coming on today. I appreciate it. We're going to talk about Stacey's article first in the May issue, and that article is titled Multi-Congregation Parishes, Lively Word and Sacrament Ministry, in which she talks about a phenomenon in the LCMS called multi-congregation parishes. Stacey, kick us off first. What is a multi-congregation parish?
So a multi-congregation parish, a formal multi-congregation parish agreement, usually they enter into a contract agreement and there's kind of a formal designation of this congregation is going to put in this amount of money, the other congregation will put in this amount, and essentially they share a pastor or administrative team depending on the size. But it can be 2, 3, 4 congregations. There are also, the story covers different partnership models that aren't that formal MCP, but that MCP, the number is, I think, 1,000 something. It's like almost 20% of our congregations in the Synod are in one of these agreements currently.
That's incredible. What is, we use the term MCP. What's a common phrase, other common words that people might use to describe this MCP or multi-congregation parish?
People will call them dual parishes a lot, or you'll hear them, tri-parish, quad parish, but this MCP, multi-congregation parish, is the umbrella term for sharing a pastor or administrative team. What's
most common, sharing pastors or administrative teams? Like what's kind of the most common?
The most common tends to be one pastor, and they tend to be in rural or small town areas where it's a couple of small congregations that can't fully support one pastor on their own, so they team together, and there's the one pastor, maybe sometimes a shared secretary or some other staff member that's there as well, but usually just one sole pastor.
Why is it important? At this time, this issue, is talking about the church. Really, kind of one of the key articles. The other key article was the marks of the church and how do you find the church. Dr. Mummy wrote that article in this issue, and it was a really, really great article. But why focus on the church, this aspect of the church now? What's kind of important about that in our current context?
Yeah, well, the numbers part of it is that there are declining congregations, just numbers-wise, in the sense that our LCMS membership is aging and some of these congregations are getting smaller. And so that's kind of the efficient cause. A lot of congregations are getting to this point and saying, well, we can't financially support a pastor, but we don't want to close. So that's kind of the practical reason why we're talking about it now. But one of the things that came up over and over again in these conversations with district presidents and pastors is that it's not just this, oh no, what do we do? It's actually this moment where the numbers are looking difficult in different places is kind of this moment of reflection where we can think about what are we doing that is maybe a reduplication of efforts in some places, or what is essential for the church to be doing. And that can be this positive refocusing for the church body. So it is a good moment to say, how can we work together as the church to accomplish our mission in an efficient way that can be a blessing to each of the congregations in the partnership, and then can bless the community as well as we're able to reach out and welcome others in.
You had this great quote in here, and I don't know if this was, I don't think it was a direct quote. I think it was your summary of what somebody else said. It's one of our pull quotes. These partnerships, if approached rightly, serve not as a tourniquet on a wound, but as a positive blessing to the church. Can you expand on that a little bit? Yeah,
I think before writing this story, when I'd heard about these sorts of congregations, I thought of it as, well, this is kind of, you get into this bad place and you kind of have to. And I sort of assumed you talk to these pastors and it's kind of, I had to take on, this complete second set of responsibilities. But everyone I spoke to was so positive about it and joyful. And it seems like so many of these work in a very fruitful way and help these congregations see that we actually were a part of a larger church all along. And maybe when we're really successful and we're able to kind of silo off and do our own thing and have our own idiosyncrasies and, hop around, if that particular congregation doesn't suit us, we can lose sight of that. But when we're forced to circumstantially work together, it helps us to see, wow, we have all of these partners out there who, are 5 miles down the street, and there's another congregation there, and it can really help us refocus on what the church is, what the pastor's there for, and it can be a really positive thing.
That's great. Sarah, I'm going to put you on the spot real quick and ask you, have you had any experience in your life as an LCMS Lutheran with one of these multi-congregation parishes? Do you know anybody in these contexts? Do you know a pastor or anything like that?
No, I've never experienced it myself, no.
Your article, which we're going to get to in just a minute, focuses predominantly on international partner churches. Did any of this come up as these churches work together, as they worked kind of in the founding? This same concept of a multi-congregation parish, did it come up at all in your studies?
Yeah, it did come up. And I think in pretty much all of these histories that happened fairly frequently, where there was a sort of circuit rider pastor who was attending to 3 or 4 congregations or maybe more, because there's one of the predominant themes is there's always a shortage of pastors, or even if there are pastors, then we need to make sure that we're educating them and getting them to seminary and that sort of thing. So it seems like this is kind of a very typical model actually for the church. It's not a tourniquet. It's just actually how we operate.
Exactly right. And this is very true for the history of the LCMS too. When I did the 175th anniversary article back in April of last year, these pastors would visit numerous congregations. The pastor out in Winnikin, out in Fort Wayne, I think he traveled something like 50 miles on horseback on a regular basis, visiting all these congregations. And all the churches we visited out there, they're like, oh yeah, some kind of connection to Winnikin, because he was just traveling from church to church, preaching and teaching. Stacey, let's get back to your article. And let me ask, what is kind of your hope with this article? What do you hope it helps the people of the LCMS as they're, in their congregations, in their own contacts? What do you hope that they can learn from this?
Yeah, well, one thing that I heard again and again, basically everyone I spoke to, people who had entered into these and then district presidents kind of advising about how these worked out the most successfully in their districts, everyone said, get started early/now. The earlier you can be looking at it and saying, even to think about it this way, if you're working together with a congregation nearby you just to do whatever you can, hold events together, have fellowship, maybe share a staff member, or even someone said share a copier, anything you can be doing to steward your resources well, then you start to form those connections that then down the road, if you do end up interested in an arrangement like this, you already have a congregation that and can work well with. So that's one aspect, just to get people aware of this and thinking about it, especially a lot of these, the Montana district, I spoke to District President Forkey of the Montana district, and I think he said 73% of congregations in Montana are in one of these multi-congregation parishes already.
That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah, but some states and some areas of some states, specifically cities, they're much less common. It's really in rural and small town areas that these have taken off. But I think to get this on the radar of people in these areas where it hasn't really hit yet so much is a really fruitful thing, especially if you look at it as not just what do we do in a time of crisis, but as something that can be this positive thing for really any church to potentially consider.
You mentioned you interviewed President Forkey. I know you did a lot of research for this, which is kind of my hope in asking both of you to do this. Sarah had like all of my archives basically from the Lutheran Witness stuck around her desk. It was pretty awesome. But I wanted you to kind of dig into this, really do some research on this. And you did quite a few interviews. Kind of tell us about the scope of who all you interviewed and talked to and kind of the research that you put into this article.
Yeah, I spoke to a number of district presidents. I kind of started there, and I couldn't talk to all of them, unfortunately. It would have been fun. But I tried to speak to people from different states that had kind of different characteristics. So I spoke to District President Lang out in California, Nevada, Hawaii, Pastor Pingle in the Eastern District, President Pingle, and then I had Wisconsin, Kansas, Montana, Minnesota, Wisconsin, just kind of a smattering. And then from there, I asked them, how are these MCPs looking in your state or your district, and who should I speak to? And then started reaching out to those pastors. So then I spoke to a smattering of pastors in these states and kind of got a spread there to some that were, I spoke to one pastor in Montana who drives 300 miles between his 3 parishes. And I spoke to one pastor of what had been a dual parish that I think they were within 2 miles or something of one another, and they just merged into one congregation. So just kind of as wide a range as I could get. So
you gathered quite a bit of information. You had a lot of stories, a lot of interviews. Obviously, we weren't able to include all of it as much as we wanted to. What's a couple of stories that you would love to have included in the issue that we couldn't keep in there? Yeah,
there was so much. I mean, a lot of them I included. I think one kind of concrete story of, I think it was a dual or a tri-parish that they had all kind of been pitching in when another one was struggling. And there were so many that were just like that I almost wish I could have just laid out, look how often this happens. It was like everyone had a story of maybe the death or sickness of one of the pastors or something where the other congregations had, because they all had this relationship, had been able to just step up and really act like the church, and not just within their own congregation, but within their dual or tri-parish. One really cool one that I wish I could have included was Pastor Scammon's dual parish in Connecticut and their merger, because he just had such a great story of coming in and 2 congregations with so much history, but, really just should be one congregation at this point. And he said he could have probably forced the merger his first year there, and they probably would have lost 20 to 30% of the congregation. And it was 5 years of conversation. They didn't lose a single member as a result of the merger. And he just told this really great story about the closing divine service at First Lutheran, which was this really cool Greenwich church, kind of like downtown, really old, beautiful building. And that ended up being the one to close because the other one was a little further out, and it was just, it made sense.
But it pains me. I mean, to close the old, beautiful,
right, on the city block.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but they did the service of the word at First Lutheran, and this sort of, I don't know what it's called, but the rite of decommissioning of a church, and then they all left, went over to St. Paul's Sanctuary, and had the service of the sacrament there, and kind of their first service as one congregation. And he said that there was one member who was there when First Lutheran was held their first opening service. She was 90 something.
Man, that's incredible.
And she, was crying, but she's still there, and she's, excited about it. And then she's, now a member at the merged church. So just everyone had so many stories like this. It was just really, it was exciting to hear.
Yeah. So as you think about Pastor Scammon's story, what's maybe one or two takeaways from that story that congregations who are considering this kind of idea of merging these 2 congregations that are close together, what are some things they can take away from that story to keep in mind as they consider this, as they say, can we do this? How should we do this? That kind of a thing.
Yeah. One thing that I heard a few people say is a lot of people, almost everyone is a fan of this in theory. It makes sense financially, and we can bless the greater church by doing this. But almost no one is a fan of, when it comes down to it, let's close my church. And which just, it's just the hardest thing when you have family history tied into it, and personal history tied into it. And it's just such a hard thing. So I think there is something to be said always about keeping 2 congregations open if possible. There's so many benefits to that, to having, even if they're pretty close, to having congregations in 2 places. I think it comes down to, and this is something that Dan Galshut said, who was he was in the Kansas district and leading up a lot of the creation of these partnership resources. He just said, think about what the church is, and are you hindering the work of the church by staying open in some way? There was a congregation in Kansas that they use as an example of church closure and merger, which I think was Faith Hugoton, that they kind of got ahead of it, and they said, you know what, we could be the greatest blessing to the church by selling our building, having our members go to this other congregation, and kind of distributing those resources from the sale to these other congregations.
Wow.
And by getting ahead of it like that, they were able to, make money off the sale before they got into this financial crisis. So I think just thinking about, in so many of these cases with the MCPs, you can continue your ministry in a really strong, fruitful way by partnering up, but just thinking like you would with forming an MCP, how can we best bless the church at large?
You listed in your article 4 obstacles that people need to watch out for: congregational identity, service times, pastor's time and attention, and community tensions, and how these obstacles can make it difficult to form one of these things. What other obstacles did you not have the space to list out that probably should be listed in there?
Yeah, I tried to make those pretty broad categories. So some of the others could maybe, be considered underneath congregational identity. That's kind of the huge one. But some of them maybe that I didn't list were just the real challenge for the pastor. And one of the district presidents said, and this was what I experienced talking to these pastors, it was amazing to me just how this district president said, I've never encountered a pastor who's not willing to do this. And they were all so enthusiastic and eager about the work. But it is a challenge, especially and this I'm sure is kind of a tie-in to Sarah's article, but one of the district presidents said it's like learning 2 languages and having to, even just learning one congregation and how to communicate the gospel clearly to them is the difficult task that a pastor faces. But to have to do that with 2 or 3 different congregations constantly as they gain and lose members in maybe 3 completely different towns, things like that are just a burden on the pastor. And then on the flip side of that, when it comes to making sure all the congregations feel that you have their attention and you're making an appearance, you and your family, in all 3 places.
I would imagine family is kind of key in there too.
Yeah.
The pastor's family always goes to one congregation, the other congregation's like, well, we want to see the kids too, or we want to see your wife. Yeah, I can imagine that being difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, and I had people say, I had some of these pastors say kind of a best practice, I suppose, of being a MCP pastor is bring your family along. But then I had a district president say, well, it does help these congregations focus on what do we need? What is the pastor called to do? And the reality is that the pastor is called and the family isn't. So some of that I think is just worked out between the congregations and the pastor. But I think when it comes down to it, that's another area where you do have to kind of overlook maybe sometimes some of these emotional tensions and just say, this is what the congregation is here for, and are we doing it?
Any other things on congregational identity?
Yeah, I talked a bit about history in the article. I think another one that came up, especially in some places, was worship styles or culture that's developed within the congregation. Not necessarily, I talked also about cultures of the 2 communities with sports rivalries and things like that, but sometimes there are just different, one of the pastors said, we build our identity around so many things that are not Jesus, and that can become an issue when you're when you're placing certain things, traditions that you've developed within your congregation, even if it's 100-year-old long-standing tradition, but it doesn't have Christ at its center, or it is something that's negotiable. Then you get to a moment where are we going to close our doors, or are we going to let this go and find a way to partner with this other congregation? So I think that's a way in which it can become a really healthy thing to step back and say, okay, what do we really need here, which is ultimately Christ.
And his gifts. That's wonderful. Yep. What's the next step in this topic? If you were going to write another article, and kind of extend this beyond what you have for our readers, what would you go next?
Yeah, I think one area that I wanted to explore more that came up with a couple of the pastors, and I just didn't really have time to even research, let alone include in the article, was just the question of MCPs in cities. Mm-hmm. So most of these statistically, and there are some in cities and especially in smaller towns, but most of them are rural or very small town kind mm-hmm. of, usually two adjacent communities or just two rural congregations partnered together. But there are a lot of cities where there are so many beautiful old buildings, mm-hmm. and the congregations in those buildings are usually a lot of history. I mean, this is where we have these amazing LCMS churches that you just, mm-hmm. to close them is just painful. But sometimes there's 30, 40 people worshiping there on a Sunday. So I don't entirely know why this hasn't come to cities as much, but it does seem like a lot of, actually several of the pastors that I spoke to had tried to get this going in a parish that they've been in a mm-hmm. city, and then there had just been, there seems to be less responsiveness from city membership for whatever reason. And one of the pastors in Kansas had tried to get this going in Cleveland, and he has this cathedral model where you mm-hmm. have kind of like an administrative team, basically based out of the most, I guess, just financially thriving congregation. Mm-hmm. And then that congregation is able to help out by blessing other more struggling congregations with a pastor mm-hmm. and some resources. And he tried to get that going in Cleveland, and it just did not take off. And I heard similar stories. So that's kind of, I think, for at least my curiosity, the next step is when this comes to cities, which it probably will start, how is that going to work? Are the models going to be different, or how do we get people more mm-hmm. open to the idea?
Yeah, that is interesting. I was wondering, and maybe this didn't come up at all, but I was wondering, I mean, it's almost like a model where you might have somebody in a church in a suburban context with more resources reaching into the city and saying, here's some, resources, a pastor, staff, finances, whatever, to help these congregations. Anything mm-hmm. come up like that? Or is the inner city stuff that's not working primarily like focused on like the city congregations themselves and not kind of going beyond that?
Yeah, I think I know, and I didn't speak to any pastors in this setting, but I know of suburban churches that are attempting church plants like that, which is great. Mm-hmm. We have this thriving suburban congregation. Let's do an outreach into the city and start mm-hmm. a new congregation. But I wonder if we couldn't pool our resources better by reaching out to a church that already exists. And not to say that church planting isn't a very good and fruitful thing. And I think that was another one that I considered with this question as a next topic actually is, should we be planting churches even though we're, working to keep our doors open in a lot of these settings? And I think the answer is yes. But if some of those suburban congregations couldn't reach out and, mm-hmm. devote some of those resources to a congregation that's already there and could use their help.
I always ask this, was there a question I should have included and did not include that some bit of information you need to get out there that I didn't think to ask about?
Yeah, I'm trying to think what the question would be. Well, you said one of the ones you emailed to me was, what hope or not do you now have for the church? Yeah. And I did just want to say, I loved talking to all of these pastors. It mm-hmm. was really, and maybe I already said this, but I really went into this thinking, man, this seems like a really hard job. And I kind of would ask the pastors, what are the challenges that come along with this, and what advice do you have for a pastor that might be called into a situation like this, thinking that there would be some caveats, and there really weren't. Everyone seemed really just eager and excited to be doing what they were doing and to have the opportunity to proclaim the gospel and keep two congregations open in two places that are doing that. So
how did the district presidents respond to this idea of multi-congregation parishes? Is this like an emphasis that the district presidents have? They're really kind of pushing this idea. I mean, what was their overall thought about the whole thing? Yeah.
Without exception, everyone that I spoke to, as soon as I reached out, said, "Yeah, this is something that is going on in our district, and there are going to be more. And maybe a range of enthusiasms, but everyone was really, this is something that's necessary, that's already going on, and that can be a really positive thing if done right. Did
you ask the question, or did it ever come up how they evaluate between we want to move this congregation toward a multi-congregation parish versus no, this is a congregation we should probably close?
Yeah.
Because we didn't address that. I don't think you addressed that in the article.
Yeah. So I did ask that, and it really, there seems to be district guidance that varies district by district for a variety of reasons. Things look very different in Montana versus, Kansas. In Montana, I think there's a quote in the story that something about if you close one of these, you might not have an LCMS congregation for 100 miles or something like that. And then in some of these, if you close, with the Connecticut example, you have now one within 2 miles instead of two within 2 miles. And then what it comes down to is that these decisions are made by the congregations in the LCMS. So the answer was often, a lot of it is about leadership and guiding people through this. Numbers ranged. Often it was around 50 is kind of the 50 members, active members is when you start really needing to look at a partnership. But yeah, at the end of the day, it does come down to the congregation. So a lot of it is just about careful guidance.
Any last words for congregations that are looking at multi-congregation parishes and any words of hope and encouragement for them or anything like that?
Yeah. One thing that almost everyone said, and I touch on this in the article, is just that keeping the purpose of the church at the center is the best step to success as partners. And so don't just look at your finances and say, oh man, we really better find somebody to team up with, but look at what you can be doing as the church in the most, how you can be stewards of what you have in the best way, stewards of the gospel, and how you can work together with those around you.
Thank you very much, Stacey, for your article, for taking the time to write this, because I didn't have the time to write it, and I think you did a great job on it. So thank you very much for that, and then also for coming on and talking to us.
Absolutely.
But you're going to stick on, and we're going to talk to Sarah now about her article. Sarah Reinsel's article in the May issue of the Lutheran Witness is Partners in the Gospel. Give us the overview, Sarah. What's the article about?
Sure. Yeah. So the article gives a really brief history of each LCMS partner church in Latin and South America. And so a partner church is someone in a different country that we are in altar and pulpit fellowship with. So that's a technical term. The altar part means that we may commune at each other's altars, right? So if I find myself at a church in Brazil, then I may commune there if they're in partnership with us. And then the pulpit part of altar and pulpit fellowship means that our pastors, right? So an LCMS pastor or a pastor from who's been ordained at the seminary in Argentina, they can preach at each other's services too. So it's a mark of orthodoxy. It's a mark of church unity that we're in agreement about our confessional identity.
Excellent. Tell me, what countries do we have partner churches? Now we're talking Latin and South America. The actual region here in terms of international mission is actually Latin America and Caribbean, but we said Latin America and South America because it actually covers kind of that whole region. So what countries are we talking about here?
Right, yeah. So we're talking Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela. I may be missing one. Mexico and Guatemala. Missing two.
The article has actually a wonderful little map here, because I'll be honest, I didn't know where all of these were. And when I saw the map, I was like, oh, I did not think Argentina was right there. I should have known that. My Asian geography is much better than my South American geography. So tell me a little bit about the research you did for this article. You stole all my archives, as I mentioned earlier, which is really delightful. I'd love to see those being used. Tell me about kind of the information you gathered, where you got it from.
Sure.
Kind of what's the scope of your research on this?
Sure. Yeah. So we have issues of the Lutheran Witness sitting behind Roy's desk that go back about 100 years, maybe a little bit more. Yeah, 100 years. And so I just pulled probably 40 of those off the shelf and barricaded myself into a cubicle for a while with those. And so these Lutheran Witnesses used to publish a lot of things that would now fall under the umbrella of maybe Reporter or Lutherans Engage the World, but there are a lot of letters from the mission field that the missionaries are just writing into the publication. So I got a lot of information from those. And I also spent several afternoons at Concordia Historical Institute down at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. So they were really helpful there in getting me into the archives and looking at different papers that were relevant to me. So there are a lot of cool things that I got to see there. So one thing that I looked at was...
It is one of my favorite places.
Yeah, it really is. It is an awesome place. I want to spend more afternoons there. So I looked at the Spanish equivalent of the Lutheran Witness called Noticiero de la Fe, which just means News of the Faith. So that's a publication all in Spanish, and they have the same content that Lutheran Witness does. So there's theological essays and devotions and that sort of thing. And then there are news updates of the different churches. So I read a lot of those. And then one of the, probably the most comprehensive single document that I looked at was a manuscript by the Reverend Gerhard Hübner, who was a longtime missionary in Argentina mostly, but it seems like he had his hand in everything. And so it was just a typewritten manuscript I looked at one that he wrote for Mexico and one for Argentina, and he did several others too. But it was really interesting. Each of these, he began with a history of the country itself before he delved into awesome. The history of LCMS missions there, and those were just a delight to read.
So Hübner, where was he really focused? Kind of what was his base of operations? I think you said he's kind of all over the place, but what was his main focus?
So he was based mainly in Argentina. Yeah, Argentina, okay. Yeah, and that makes sense too. The earliest LCMS mission efforts really began in Brazil and Argentina. So both of those churches began as mission districts. So actually, and if you look at old LCMS records, there used to be an Argentine district and a Brazil district, just like the Missouri district and the Montana district and the Texas district. So I thought that was really fun and interesting. And then those two churches were the first to become independent sister churches.
In your research, was there any discussion of why they moved from this idea of Argentine district to an independent Argentine church? What was kind of was there any discussion about that behind the scenes?
It sounds like logistics to me that really? It would just be, the amount that you had to travel back and forth between St. Louis and Argentina just would get unrealistic at some point, especially pre-airplanes. So I think there's that. And then also with each of these churches, as soon as there are church plants, as soon as the talk of becoming an independent partner church begins, there's also, and we need a seminary too. And so I think that's probably another reason why churches, especially these two early ones, moved from the district model to an independent model. It's easier to run locally. But
gotcha.
Yeah.
In your research, you of course did a lot of it. Once again, we had to cut in order to get it to fit in the magazine. As you did your research, what did you find kind of the most interesting thing in your research? Yeah, so I think the thing that struck me the most was how familiar it all sounded. It just sounded like all of that I was reading just sounded like early church history, or I recently read a early medieval history of the growth of the church in England, and it's like, same story. Like there's persecution, there's controversy over doctrine, there's problems with not having enough pastors. There are pastors who are just globetrotting constantly and doing the best they can to serve as many people as they can. There's political unrest. There's basically everything you can imagine. It's just the same story again and again, because I think that's the universal story of the gospel. So that broadly, that's what I found the most interesting. Kind of a more particular story that I loved was one that came out of Caracas in Venezuela. So back in the 1950s, 1960s, Caracas was very cosmopolitan, it seemed like. And there was this trilingual LCMS parish there. And it turned out that for all of these people who had immigrated from all over the world, the common language was Spanish. And so you had Finnish Lutherans and Latvian Lutherans and German Lutherans and local Venezuelans all attending church here.
I just thought that was really neat.
That is really neat. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So then who was the pastor there? At the
I can't remember off the top of my head what his name was. Yeah.
But so then he ended up doing everything in Spanish despite all of these European languages.
Right. That Spanish was, I mean, because you're used to hearing English as kind of the lingua franca or whatever. But yeah, no, Spanish was the common language between everybody.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So what other stories did you have to cut that you would have loved to include in this?
Well, I brought one of, I stole a Lutheran Witness from you again. I brought one because I included part of this story in the Guatemala section, but I had to cut a lot of it. And this is the story of a seminarian who actually was arrested and put into prison for 33 hours. Thankfully, not any longer than that. But I just wanted to read a little bit of it just because I had to. So it was the Reverend Robert Gussick who wrote this letter into the Lutheran Witness, and he had such a wonderful storytelling voice, and I just wanted to quote it at length.
Sure,
but I couldn't
give us the reference. Give us the reference. What year are we?
So this is in 1949. So Guatemala in 1949, and this little bit. So let's see here. Trouble broke out in Puerto Barrios when a cache of arms was discovered. The government sent down reinforcements and a general roundup of all suspicious characters had been ordered. At that time, Ted had been helping out and cutting timber for the thatched chapel in the jungle. When he came in that day from the jungle, his pants and boots were covered with mud, and the guards posted on the outskirts of the city picked him up on suspicion as a foreigner who, in their estimation, had no good reason for being in the jungle. Back in the police station, the papers which Ted carried did him little good, for often many people are not able to read. So into the prison he went. The old LWs are just full of stuff like that. So, and
he eventually got out at 33.
Yes, right.
So what's kind of the resolution of the story?
Right. So the resolution of the story is there's somebody from the United Fruit Company who recognizes him and puts pressure on the guards to get him out. And thankfully, he's only there for a little more than a day, and all's well that ends well. And I suppose that's the other really wonderful thing about all of these stories that I came across is they're so joyful in spite of being recounting pretty scary things. Mm-hmm. And I guess that is just real Christian joy just coming through. Mm-hmm. Even stories of arrest.
Yeah, no kidding. There are plenty of those, right?
Yeah.
Off the top of your head, as you think about these various countries that you wrote about and the partner churches in each of these various countries, what makes each of these countries kind of unique in the work that went on there and in their congregational life?
Yeah. So, of course, each country has its own unique history and unique political circumstances, especially. And in the 20th century, there's a lot happening in, a place like Venezuela or Mexico. And, and then also, some of these begin, like we talked about a second ago, they begin as mission districts of the LCMS. Others begin as daughter churches. Mm-hmm. So Argentina is responsible for the Paraguayan daughter church. So they really get that off the ground. And then also just the people that they're ministering to, that kind of varies as well. So with places like Brazil and Argentina, those churches really began with communities of German immigrants who moved there, much like they moved to the United States in the 19th century. And in other places, the mission work began immediately among the local people. It didn't begin with immigrants who were kind of already Lutheran and just needing a pastor. Yeah.
Was there an impulse among the Germans from your kind of reading? Was there an impulse among the Germans to reach out to the local community, or was it fairly insular? As Germans can be sometimes.
I get the impression that it was fairly insular for a long time. But I think in the way that like immigrant communities just sort of are, like there's a language barrier, there's a cultural barrier. I guess in Brazil, many of the Lutherans who moved there were trying to break off from the Prussian Union of Churches. Mm-hmm. They were trying to maintain a real confessional identity, for the same reason that people moved to the United States and started the LCMS. So there are a lot of impulses to just like, okay, let's clarify who we are and let's stick to it, and we're not going to try and do too much else. But then the Lord always works through us, right? And so around World War II, actually back in World War I as well, there's a lot of anti-German sentiment in South America especially, and speaking German was outlawed or discouraged, or these sorts of things. And then later, more in 50s, 60s, 70s, and this happened in Venezuela. The kind of as these countries are coming to their own as 21st century countries or whatever, they really enforce, okay, Spanish only is going to be spoken in our schools. And so once again, these German communities kind of had to adapt and start, even if they weren't forbidden from speaking German, they had to speak Spanish in the classroom. And so that just forced outreach, and it really did result in the community changing and more people hearing the gospel, I think.
There was an interesting little tidbit in your article about a group of Germans during World War II that were actually sent to the United States, and kind of some connections they made there. Give us that little short story. I thought that was kind of neat. I think a lot of people aren't aware of kind of the background of this type of story.
Okay, so are you thinking of the North Dakota internment camp one?
So, yeah.
Okay, that was a wild story. So it's so far flung too. So what happened was there were German Guatemalans living in Guatemala, and they got sent to an internment camp in North Dakota.
And this was a common thing.
Right, this was a common thing, right? So sort of like the Japanese internment camps too. Like there was a lot of suspicion, if you're on the wrong side, right, then we're shipping you off. Like this is kind of a scary thing.
And I kind of knew this happened within the U.S. I didn't know that people were shipped from like South America to the U.S. They're like, here, you take care of them, you watch it.
Because we don't want to deal with them.
Yeah.
So anyway, so these Guatemalan Germans wind up in North Dakota, and they're ministered to there by an LCMS pastor. And when thankfully they do get to return to Guatemala eventually, and they write back to the LCMS and say, hey, send us a pastor. So that was a very, very cool story.
That's incredible. And was that kind of the start then of mission work, LCMS work in Guatemala?
Yeah.
That's very cool. That's pretty neat. In your course of study, as you kind of were preparing this article, did you come across any, future plans for work in Latin America and the Caribbean and South America?
Yeah, I guess I didn't. This is one thing that, well, I guess the biggest thing that I had to leave out was I felt like most of my histories were very front loaded, and how I was telling them, and that was mostly just time constraints. But so I guess I did not research that.
Quite all right. I just figured I'd ask.
Right.
Anyways.
Yeah.
Why do you think this is an important topic for the LCMS to be hearing about now? I mean, we're going to talk about in a minute, kind of future plans, what we're doing with this, but why is this kind of an important topic now?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's really cool to see the work of the church everywhere. This gets back to what Stacey was saying earlier about, understanding what the church is, that, it's where Christ is, and where we hear the word and receive the sacraments, and that is the mark of the church. So I think that's really, really cool and good for people to remember, is that we're not just in the United States. This is the gospel is a universal thing meant for everyone, and it is working everywhere. And I also think that studying church history is really important too. It's important to have a sense of continuity and a sense of where you came from, and it also just helps us understand, I think, like even the incarnation better, right? As God works in concrete ways in history. So studying church history is studying who Jesus is.
There's also a sense in which I think it's important for our churches, as we look towards convention in particular. We actually have a number of resolutions coming up. You're probably not, I don't know if you're aware of this, but we have a number of resolutions coming up on declaring partnership, fellowship, altar and pulpit fellowship with other churches. And then also something that hasn't happened in many years, breaking fellowship with a church body over false doctrine and false practice. So I think it's important also, just so that people have a sense of what's out there, who we're in fellowship with, kind of the life of the Lutheran Church around the globe. Speaking of which, do you have any plans for future articles?
Yes, I would love to keep writing these if you will keep letting me write them.
That is the plan. The question is whether we're going to do it online or in print. If we do it online, then we can just let her go hog wild and she can write 3,000 word articles on each one.
Well, and this is my question for hey, everyone out there in the LCMS. Has anyone attempted a history like this before? Like, is this something that, are there more manuscripts in CHI archives that, there is actually a fully formed history of these things already in existence that's just waiting to be published? But
we'll have to look into it. Yeah. More time in CHI. So.
Yeah.
Last question. Is there anything I should have asked and didn't ask? Anything that you don't have to phrase it as a question, but anything that, you really want to get out there that I didn't think to ask about?
Yeah, I can't think of anything.
Stacey, did you have any questions for Sarah?
Yeah, I guess just hearing about some of these stories, especially where there's a pastor who maybe knows 4 languages and is holding a divine service in 3, or it kind of reminded me, I think I mentioned this earlier, but of some of the language that people used kind of metaphorically to talk about these MCPs, and the pastors having to learn 2 languages to preach, even to adapt their sermons to preach to these 2 separate congregations. And some people saw that almost as a positive, because having these 2 congregations forces you to actually see that reality that would be there with one congregation as well, which is that you need to make sure, there's a task of translation almost in communicating, making sure you're communicating clearly to your people. So I guess, did you see any of that in these congregations, and what can we maybe learn from some of these pastors who were out on the mission field?
Yeah. It seems like there's all this evidence of really preaching to the people who are right in front of you, and that means doing it in Spanish or doing it in Portuguese a lot of times when your original language, native language, is German or something like that. And so that, I think that forces a lot of clear thinking on your own part, a lot of clear theology, clear writing, and then also like you have to get to know the people who you're speaking to, and that just puts a real emphasis on, we're here for individual people who are here for the gospel, and so there's this kind of purity there, and ultra focus rather than all these other fluffy distractions that we think are the church sometimes, and they're really not. But
But actually, let me turn that question around also to you, Stacey. As you were doing a kind of multi-congregation parish study, was there any sort of actual multilingual emphasis there in terms of a congregation saying, we live in a predominantly Spanish community. We're going to either find another church to partner with that focuses in Spanish, or we're going to add maybe another Spanish congregation to our own? Like, is there any sense of that sort of a thing in your MCP study?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I know I heard an example of this in one of the cities that had been tried, and I can't remember what language it was, but it was some immigrant community that then there was a community there that there was a congregation that I don't think they had been holding services in that language, but there was like enough of a bulk of people that spoke that language there that then there was like this attempt to merge these 2 together, and I can't remember what language it was, so it's not very helpful, but yeah, I know that has been attempted, where you can kind of link together these 2 ministries that can serve in this language, and then spread the gospel in that way.
That's great. Anything else, Sarah, on your article?
I think that's all I've got.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you especially to Sarah and Stacey for joining me on the podcast today, for writing these articles for the magazine, and for joining us on the podcast today. If you have any questions or want to follow up, you can send us an email at lutheran.witness@lcms.org. How can people get a hold of you, Stacey?
Mine would be Stacey Egger. That's Stacey, Stacey .egger@lcms.org.
And mine's sarah.reinsel@lcms.org, sarah.reinsel@lcms.org.
So if you have any other further questions or any other information that you'd like to share, you can feel free to reach out to Sarah and Stacey. Thank you once again for joining me. And I hope we can do this again in the future, because I really enjoyed this. So thank you to all of you out there who are listening to the Lutheran Witness podcast, where we help you learn to interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.